Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. And in this one, we are going to be doing a meta update. Let's take a deep dive and look at what specializations are succeeding in Dragonflight Season 3 so far. Is the game completely imbalanced, or is it a lot more balanced than really first anticipated? And if you want to stay up to date with educational and entertaining content related to World of Warcraft, then smash the subscribe button. Your support is greatly appreciated. So the first thing that jumps off the page here, we're going to be looking at analytics, covering a difference of thresholds in brackets. Right now, we are looking at the representation of specializations at 1800 rating and above. So you can see for melee DPS that there is a very big overlap of melee DPS that focus on just doing raw throughput damage, and these are the melee specializations with the highest raw throughput damage. So Havoc Demon Hunter at the top at 23% representation, Unholy Death Knight at just under 20% representation, Arms Warrior at 18% representation, and even Ret Paladin at 11% representation, and then Windwalker at 8% representation. So I would say that based on the ease of their damage and their actual damage output is what is leading to this representation here at the top. When we look at the bottom, though, Enhancement Shaman is at 1.6%, and I almost want to say that, there's 237 Enhancement Shamans. Probably like 50% of these are one player. His name is Big Dam, and he plays Enhanced Shaman. He's probably half of these Enhancement Shamans. When I see him in the games, it doesn't seem like a terrible specialization. I see a lot of 3v3 comps actually incorporating Enhancement Shaman, so I don't know if Enhancement Shaman still just has a stigma against it, and that's why its representation is so low at 1.64%, or if there's a very specific way that you need to play this specialization in order to succeed. I know he's playing like an Ellie Blast build. Maybe you need to coordinate that a lot more than what a Havoc Demon Hunter needs to do in order to succeed. But Enhancement to me is a lot better than where it's currently ranked, almost as the worst melee DPS for Shuffle. But that title is actually going to Feral Druid at only 219 Feral Druids above 1800. Main contributing factor to this, I think, is defense. Surviving on a Feral Druid is really tough at the moment. While you can be tactical and strategic and play off your Cyclone talents and reset your Feral Frenzy, it's just way harder to get a win over these other specializations due to your inherent less tankiness. You're just going to be falling over a lot more often than not. Frost Death Knight is just an incredibly counter-compy specialization. You're either getting lobbies with all melee DPS where you're going to feel really good and strong, or you're going to get lobbies with casters where you're not really able to get too much effectively done. To me, Frost Death Knight is still likely in need of a class rework or a class update. I would really like some new abilities for Frost, because I feel like it's severely underdeveloped in terms of overall abilities. Some abilities focused around crowd control, so that you can be more strategic than just grip, AoE stun, big damage. I think it needs more layers to it than that, because at the moment it plays like a MOBA character, and that could open up more opportunities for it in terms of other compositions. Outlaw Rogue, surprisingly, very low representation as well. This is a specialization, though, that if you play at the highest level, you are going to absolutely see a tremendous amount of success, but it is way harder to play it at that level than it is to, get 70% of what you'd need on these specs at the top to get rating. So I think a lot of people, what happens is that they give up on Outlaw before they get to the point where they see its potential. Whereas Arms Warrior, Unholy Death Knight, and Havoc Demon Hunter, you can get to 80% of its maximum and be getting pretty decent results. So you're seeing success a lot faster. So people are going to, go towards the path of least resistance, and that tends to be these specializations. Fury Warrior, I've been trying my best to be playing this, but it is not going nearly as well as what I had really anticipated it to be going, given its set bonus and how powerful it is. Every once in a while, I get a big Bloodthirst crit that one-shots somebody, but it feels really lackluster. Your Mortal Wounds effect not stacking or not superseding other MS effects is really frustrating, because it's really the only mechanic that even remotely makes you good. And if you don't have it, you're just so much worse. Your overall damage is just so much lower. It needs a lot of attention in terms of overall damage buffs. In my mind, things towards Rampage, likely to even come close to competing with Arms, Unholy, or Havoc. Fury just needs a ton of help when it comes to balance changes. Survival Hunter is unfortunately in a position where Beast Mastery, we can see it on the range when we get to it, but it's just so outshined by what Beast Mastery is capable of doing at the moment that it's tough to pick it over Beast Mastery. It's just, this is way less keybinds, way less things that you need to do overall to be effective to win the game. So again, path of least resistance. A lot of players are going to be more catered into this. Although I wouldn't say that survival is in as bad of shape as Fury Warrior. I think that you can definitely still make it work, but when players are looking for the path of least resistance and they've got 3 choices, survival, MM, and BM, they're probably going to lean more into Beast Mastery. And there's probably a lot of people who play Hunter that don't want to be melee. They want to be ranged. They want like the Legolas fantasy as well. And I'm sure, spec fantasy plays a lot into spec choice overall for representation. But survival is pretty decent, I would say. But it's representation, it's almost the same as enhance. It's really low down here. Assassination Rogue is actually a lot higher than I had expected. I have seen Assassination Rogues doing really well. King's Bane crits hitting really hard. Again, main problem for you is defense and survivability, but the fact that it's actually higher than Outlaw, I think plays more into that. Kidney shotting one target and it does a lot of single target damage, so you can win games just using kidney shot on the target you're attacking and pressing your cooldowns on cooldown and probably get decently high rating, whereas Outlaw Rogue requires a bit more finesse, I think, in terms of control of the game, in order to maximize its damage and maximize its control of its enemies. So Assassination to me is kind of like the easy mode version of Rogue, so because its damage is actually respectably high, not as high as these specializations obviously, or else its representation would be much higher, and its tankiness is much lower, but that's why it's actually seen some representation. It's not nearly as bad as what a lot of people would say for it. But Subtlety Rogue only at 5% at above 1800. Again, the things that you need to do in order to win on this specialization are a lot more than just maximize your rotation. For these classes, they basically have a priority system. You need to press this ability. If it's not available, press this ability. If that's not available, press this, and it's usually around 3 or 4 priority abilities that they need to do. Subtlety Rogue doesn't have that type of rotation. Subtlety Rogue is a sequence. You need to know the exact order during your stuns of what abilities you need to press to do the maximum amount of damage, and if you don't press them in the right order and you don't successfully take down the target in that stun lock, then you're not going to see success. And that's the main reason I think that its representation is a lot lower than what it should be for its power, but it's still actually quite high, relative to its history. Subtlety Rogue is usually it's usually down here at 1%, because not a lot of players can do it. I think a lot of players are learning the one-shot sequence, but then they're fumbling on their defensive management, right? So the highest level of play will be monitoring its vanish charges, keeping track of his cheat death available, what types of crowd controls do they have available to peel in order to survive in critical moments. I would say that defensive management is a lot more active than a lot of these other specializations, and a lot less forgiving as well. If you don't react fast enough, you can just explode. But if you are reacting fast enough and you know the sequence, you're completely unstoppable. And I think that's going to be shown here when we look at the representation of 2700 plus, which is where Subtlety Rogues dominate 75% of the overall bracket at this rating. So you can see on the top end of the ladder that definitely they are powerful, but at the lower end, if you don't know what you're doing, it's going to be a lot harder to succeed than on these other specializations. When we look at ranged, we already talked about it, but Beast Mastery is a big outlier. Actually, I wasn't expecting it to be this high at 16%. I think the main reason for this is Call of the Wild. The Call of the Wild cooldown during Bestial Wrath is just probably one of the highest amounts of damage output that's, seemingly unstoppable, because if players aren't paying attention to the pets and CCing the pets, you're just going to actually kill somebody through every single cooldown in the game. Like, it's just going to be so impossible to deny. So damage output is why Beast Mastery is up here, and you can see that's a huge contributing factor to the representation of a lot of these specs. It's just their overall scoreboard damage is really high. Demonology, I've personally gotten over 2500 on Affliction and Destro, and I'm trying to do Demonology, and so far Demonology has actually felt harder, even though it's the most represented spec here, probably because I'm rusty on it, and it's a lot different than any other specialization. But Demo is a really high representation at 12.63%. And you can follow me on my stream if you want. I'm going to be continuing this journey of trying to get Demo up as well, over the 2500 threshold. But the fact that it's so high is likely due to its overall damage, and most of its damage is pretty automatic. I've noticed it mostly comes from your Felguard and likely your Dreadstalker. So if you're getting those casts and your pet is attacking something, you're pressing Fellstorm on cooldown, you're doing most of your effective damage. And it's also a lot tankier than the other Warlock specializations. I think these two in hand are likely leading to why Demonology is more represented, but it's not by much. I mean, Destro is literally like 0.2 2% behind. And like when we looked at the 2700 representation, Destro was the only lock spec with 2 of them above 2700. So obviously there's a lot of specs that are very close with each other in terms of competitive nature, and Destruction having multiple schools of magic, a lot of its damage based off these dimensional rifts, which are instant applied. They open up the portal and it sends out blasts onto the target. This mechanic is what is enabling Destruction Warlock to be so powerful at the moment. You just maintain immolates and then reset rifts and you're absolutely destroying everybody. Elemental Shaman still remains at 10% representation for solo shuffle, which is actually surprisingly higher than Balanced Druid, because if we were to do a tournament, I'd be putting Balanced Druid ahead of Elemental. But with its 4-step bonus, it's doing a remarkable amount of damage. What do you know? Damage output, the ease of doing its damage, Flame Shock, and press instant cast Lava Burst. And again, you're probably 90% of the way there. So its representation is really high. Although it is not necessarily that inherently tanky, but if you know how to kite with it and use Frost Shock Root and know how to use all the knockbacks that it has, it can be very difficult for melee DPS to connect onto you. And I think that's why, as players are getting better at Elemental, that its representation is starting to go up, especially at lower rating where you do only see melee. Ellie actually can do really well in those situations. Balanced Druid is the same case. I think Cyclone is like the best crowd control in the game, period, at the moment. It's just really good overall. With 2-minute cooldown Incarn, you get 2 of them in a game. Second one usually wins a round, similar to how Call of the Wild is a very powerful cooldown and a 2-minute cooldown. So it's not surprising to see it at 10%. You can see the range though are a lot more balanced, reasonably, than the melee, and it could just be because these ranged, they can mostly focus on doing damage and succeed by just doing damage without any sort of like strict rotational requirement. Frost Mage, same thing, 8.38%. It's actually the most represented mage spec in solo shuffle. I was expecting Arcane, but again, at lower rating, I think Frost is easier to play than Arcane, and we'll probably see that if we advance up the bracket here and just take a look at this. So Frost Mage is still higher than Arcane at 2100. Frost Mage is actually still higher at 2400, and then actually Frost Mage is just better. Frost Mage is actually more represented than Arcane, even across all of the thresholds, which is a bit surprising to me. I was expecting Arcane to eventually take it over, but Frost is actually more represented. I think with Frostbomb combos with Glacial Spike, it's obviously got a lot of one-shot potential, really good into melee DPS, which are obviously really represented, so you're going to see those more often than not, so likely contributing to why it's succeeding in those cases. Devastation Evoker in a great spot. I'd say ideally you'd want your representation to be somewhere from like 7 to 10, maybe 6 to 10% is probably like a healthy margin where like you're reasonably balanced against the other classes, and it's probably coming down to skill and maybe a little bit of things that are overtuned on the top. So this range is really good in terms of your overall competitiveness. So 8% for Devastation, and I don't think that's surprising with how much damage it does, but its weakness to rogues likely dragging it down a bit. Marksmanship Hunter is actually really low at the moment at 5.25%. I was expecting this to be a bit higher, but you can get lobbies with Death Knights and look at the representation of the classes that are going to be difficult for you, like Death Knights and Warriors stacked together. It's going to be tough for you to succeed. You're way less mobile than Beast Mastery, and those are the main factors, and it's tough for you to do damage to high armor targets. Shadow Priest is still holding decently strong at 4.72%, considering that I pretty much almost never see them. And again, you're going to struggle with things like Windwalker Monk. You're going to struggle with the Warriors that are definitely higher on representation, and it's just going to feel like you are playing hard mode version of the game, where you have to cast everything and everybody else is running around you, flipping around in circles, doing instant cast blast damage and just totally running you over. So it's going to be really frustrating. So I think that's why likely it's down here. It doesn't help that your Mass Dispel went to a 2-minute cooldown as well, so any sort of utility advantages you would have had over other DPS are kind of lost. But 4.72 is still respectably high when you consider it to something like Enhancement's 1.64%. So it's going to be a bit of a struggle, but it seems like it's still possible to succeed. Affliction Lock's getting a much higher representation than it has in other seasons at 4.35%. Still probably not my ideal range of 6% and up, but definitely doing way better than before. I think higher dampening pace, the overall damage output that it's able to put out. If you're using amp curses effectively, you can definitely stagger games long enough to be able to start to succeed. So it's in a decent spot. And Arcane is really surprising to see down here at 3.75%. I think Arcane is similar to Subtlety, but probably a little bit more forgiving, other than the fact that you have to cast spells, so you can be interrupted a lot more frequently. But if you're not lining up your damage around Touch of the Magi or Arcane Surge, you really aren't going to win a game. Like, you have to set up damage during these windows, or it's not possible to win. And that's very similar to subtlety. So if a lot of players don't understand what those windows are, or they're failing to hit those windows, I think that's probably why you're going to see this percent go down. And then fire is really surprising at 3.35%, because I think out of all the mages, it's the easiest spec to do effective damage, like really high scoreboard damage and win on pressure. But the main reason is that it's squishiness. So you can see that, you know, damage is valuable. Like, fire will compete with some of these specs on the scoreboard if it's left alone, for sure. But if you are not tanky enough, your representation will go down staggeringly. You'll just be the target for most shuffles and ran down. So Feral Druid and Fire Mage, their survivability is low, and they are struggling as a result of that in shuffle. And then Augmentation Evoker, Devastation and Augmentation are basically very similar in terms of, you know, gameplay, with Upheaval versus Fire Breath and charged spells and spamming Disintegrate versus spamming Eruption. It's actually a very similar gameplay loop, but Devastation has just got higher performance numbers at the moment. So I think that's why it's, you know, it's represented more than Augmentation. It's just higher numbers over Augmentation. For healers, Discipline Priest, 30%. Again, I think Disc is just one of the most accessible healers for a lot of people who may want to re-roll to healer, because it does damage to heal. So it's a lot more fun if you're a DPS main to play a Disc. I think Disc is the most fun healer at the moment. But again, that does change as you climb up rating, right? Resto Druid almost immediately starts taking Disc over when you start looking at like over 2100, and it starts falling off even further to Holy Paladin as you start to get higher and higher rating, which I don't think is too surprising. You can see the thresholds shift as well, with Destro coming back up to the top in terms of casters, and higher ratings on Boomkin as you get higher rating. And Arcane does actually come up a bit towards the top end. And even Feral starts coming up towards the top end as we move higher and higher rating. But Disc is really good still. It's just towards the top end, you have to start playing out of your mind. Resto Druid just needed to get a little bit of a touch-up of nerfs. I'm surprised we didn't see anything coming through on this Friday. Holy Paladin's actually in a really solid position overall. I think that it's just a really good healer. I think the Purge Protection of its set bonus is putting it in a strong spot. Mistweaver is actually doing surprisingly good as well. I was expecting this number to fall off a lot more than it is, but seemingly, you know, if you can play Fistweaver and Caster, I think it's in flex between those depending on the lobby, I think you can see a decent ride in Shuffle. And even Resto Shaman at 11.25% is still a lot higher representation than I was expecting. You can see like these healers are actually getting a lot closer to each other. It's really just Resto Druid is an outlier. Prez Evoker definitely struggling though, and again, this is probably coming down to survivability. You have to get really close to the game, which exposes you to crowd control and being attacked a lot more than other healers. And especially if these healers just have way more throughput than you and can just avoid any sort of stressful situations and you're stuck in them, you're not gonna have a good time. And then Holy Priest at 0.4%. Holy Priest, you take the title of the worst spec in the game. I mean, when we look at overall representation, right? We're looking at the worst spec in the game is Holy Priest. And as you get to higher ratings, Fire Mage actually falls below Augmentation, which is really surprising. I'm gonna have to play Fire Mage. If you guys want to watch that, make sure you check out my stream. It's in the description. I'm gonna have to try it because I want to know why is Fire Mage, it is so low. It's probably a combination of like all the multiple hunter specs, I would think. Doing well in these Warlock Shaman combos. I'm gonna have to give this a go as to why it's less than 1% at this threshold of rating at the moment for Mage, because this is a bit startling here. So the game is definitely reasonably balanced considering the history of the game usually. When you think about the ladder, right? For tournament play, I think we're going to start to see a very steep imbalance towards Druid and Subtlety Rogue, but when it comes to the ladder, it's actually in a pretty good spot. I think that's why I'm seeing a lot of people say that, hey, they actually really like the game at the moment. If we could just see a couple of touch-ups towards these outliers that are at the absolute rock bottom and a couple of them at the top that are a little more overrepresented, I mean, this could be a phenomenal conclusion to the season in terms of overall game balance. But let me know what you guys think. What has your experience been on the Solo Shuffle ladder? I hope that you guys enjoyed this meta update and this deep dive, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching.